September 16, 1943. Tukina Airfield, Bougainville, Solomon Islands. Captain James "Jimmy" Sweat watches his wingman go down. An F4U Corsair tumbles into the jungle, trailing a plume of black smoke. The pilot's final scream is cut off mid-transmission. That makes the third aircraft VMF 213 has lost this week, not to superior enemy airplanes or mechanical failures, but because their ammunition is being wasted. Sweat's own gun camera film tells the cruel truth. He emptied 400 rounds at a zero from roughly 300 yards and watched the tracers fly all around the target, over it, under it, to the left and right, forming a ring of fire with nothing in the center. The zero slipped through. Sweat's guns were dry. 2 minutes later, that same zero shot down his wingman. Across Marine fighter squadrons in the South Pacific, the statistics are grim. Despite the Corsair's clear advantages in speed and firepower, Marine pilots are only achieving a 3.2.1 kill ratio against Japanese planes. The Corsair mounts 650 cal Browning M2s with about 3,000 rounds total, roughly 25 seconds of continuous firing. Yet pilots are burning through their belts and usually score only one hit per 50 rounds. The issue isn't pilot skill or defective weapons. It's how the guns are aimed to meet. Gun harmonization, the setting that makes all 6 wing guns' trajectories intersect, is the culprit. Factory specs call for convergence at 1,000 feet. At that range, bullets cover a 30-foot circle. A Japanese Zero with wings is about 29 feet across. Pilots are trying to thread needles while closing at 300 mm. VMF 213. The Hellhawks have the worst rounds per kill ratio in the Pacific. 890 rounds fired for each confirmed enemy plane destroyed. At that burn rate, the squadron will run out of ammunition long before they run out of Japanese aircraft. Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, visiting from VMF 214, watches Sweat's gun camera footage and can only shake his head. "You're firing at phantoms," he tells them. "Your bullets are everywhere but where the enemy is." What? Sweat and the other pilots don't know. What? Nobody in the squadron knows yet. Is that a 26-year-old? Aviation ordnance corporal with no college and no formal engineering training is watching the same footage inside the maintenance tent. He's a sergeant who joined the Marines to escape the Depression. His duty is loading ammo and keeping guns working, not redesigning aircraft, but his improvised change is about to make the Corsair the deadliest fighter in the Pacific. The problem of gun convergence plagues every fighter force, but in the Pacific, it is costing Marine lives. Since World War I, the standard solution has been to mount guns in the wings and angle them slightly inward so their bullets meet at a single point ahead of the plane. Fly the enemy through that convergence and all guns strike at once. Devastating. The difficulty is choosing the right distance. Factory settings for the F4U put convergence at 1,000 feet. The designers at Vought had reasons. At that distance, a pilot has time to acquire the target, lead it properly, and hold a sustained burst as it crosses the convergence zone. It's a compromise between range and likelihood of hits. Combat, however, proves those assumptions wrong. At 1,000 feet, the target is simply too small. The Corsair's 6 guns are spread across 16 feet of wing. At that convergence, even a perfectly aimed burst makes a tight cone at the intersection, but fans out sharply before and after. Most dogfights occur at 200 to 400 yards, where the pattern is about 20 feet wide. Japanese planes slip through the gaps. Squadrons try changing the setting. VMF 124 tests 800-foot convergence and sees marginal improvement. VMF 214 goes to 600 feet and does better still, but rounds still scatter too widely at real combat ranges. The experts warn against setting convergence closer than 500 feet. Doing so, they say, risks overstressing gun mounts and damaging wing structure. Because the guns are mounted at steep angles, bringing their intersection point nearer increases recoil loads on the brackets. Wing panels could fatigue and fail. Planes might break apart in flight. Lieutenant Colonel William Millington, operations officer for Marine Aircraft Group 11, put it bluntly in an August 1943 memo. Gun convergence under 500 feet exceeds the F4U airframe's safe structural limits. Pilots must engage at the prescribed optimal range. In other words, don't blame the equipment. improve your shooting. Yet losses continue to climb. September 1943 is the bloodiest month yet. Marine fighters in the Solomons lose 47 aircraft to enemy action. Analysis of gun camera footage shows that 78% of those losses happened after pilots expended their ammunition without delivering fatal concentrated hits. They scored numerous non-critical strikes, but not the focused fire needed to destroy enemy planes. Japanese intelligence intercepts include a translated radio exchange from September 12, 1943. The Corsairs are fast, but their shooting is weak. Their bullets scatter like rain. Stay close. They cannot hit accurately. When their guns are empty, attack. The Japanese begin deliberately drawing Corsairs into wasting ammo, and then counterattacking when the Americans are defenseless. The stakes go far beyond individual squadrons. Air superiority in the Solomons is vital. Without it, the Navy cannot support amphibious assaults. The island-hopping campaign grinds to a halt. The Pacific War is stretched out by years, and casualties multiply. On September 14, 1943, General Roy Geiger, commander of the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, speaks to squadron leaders. "We have the best aircraft in the theater. We have the best pilots. We are losing because we cannot hit what we shoot at. I need solutions now." No one has an answer. The guns function. The ammunition is fine. The pilots are competent. Speed and performance don't matter if bullets fail to strike. The Marine Corps is desperate for a fix. They're about to get one from an ordnance man with a wrench. Staff Sergeant Michael Joseph McCarthy doesn't look like an innovator. Born March 8, 1917 in South Boston, Massachusetts, Mickey McCarthy learned to fix cars in his father's garage. He left high school, never attended college, and holds no engineering credentials. When the Depression hit, he enlisted in the Marines for steady pay and regular meals. He became an aviation ordnance crewman, the men who load guns, maintain firing gear, and clear spent casings. By September 1943, McCarthy has been assigned to VMF 2113 for 8 months. He's competent. The guns operate reliably, ammunition feeds without jams, and misfires are rare. He's still an enlisted mechanic. Officers set tactics. Engineers design hardware. Yet McCarthy notices something pilots and engineers overlooked. He watches every gun camera clip, reads every after-action report, and runs the numbers. On September 17, 1943, after studying Captain Sweat's failed engagement, McCarthy does something unexpected. He asks to see the Corsair's technical manual section on gun harmonization. The armory clerk looks at him as if he's mad. Ordnancemen usually don't bother with engineering documents, but the clerk passes it over anyway, and McCarthy studies it 3 times. He walks out to the flight line, climbs onto the wing of Corsair Bureau number W19883, and measures the span between the outboard and inboard guns, 16 feet 3 inches. He checks the gun mount angles, and using nothing more than basic trigonometry and the instincts from fixing car engines, works out the convergence geometry in his head. The realization hits him hard. The convergence point isn't set wrong so much as it is set too far away. At 1,000 feet, a bullet takes nearly a second to get to the target. A zero closing at about 300 mph covers roughly 440 feet in that time. So pilots are effectively firing where the enemy used to be rather than where it will be. If the convergence were moved into about 300 feet, bullets would reach the target in roughly a third of a second. The zero would move only about 50 feet during that interval, and lead calculations become far simpler. Even more crucial, at 300 feet, the combined strikes from all 6 guns cram into an area the size of a dinner plate instead of a garbage truck. McCarthy runs the math one more time. At 300-foot convergence, with every Corsair gun firing, the total volley is gargantuan. Tens of thousands of rounds worth of energy concentrated into a roughly 6-square-foot zone. That is not merely firing, it is destructive overload. A Japanese Zero with a 39-foot wingspan and a weight around 5,300 pounds would be hit with enough kinetic force in a 1-second 80-round burst per gun to tear it apart. The conclusion is stark, brutal, and likely against regulations, but McCarthy decides to try it that night. He knows a formal request to move Convergence inside the accepted 500-foot safety limit would be swallowed by bureaucracy. The armorer, maintenance officer, squadron commander, group ops, wing engineering, and the Bureau of Aeronautics would all demand analyses and reviews, and the war could be over before a decision was made. So he keeps quiet. On the night of September 18, 1943, after the flight line is shut down, McCarthy and two other ordnance men, Corporal Eddie Wilkins and PFC Tommy Reyes, roll Corsair 17883 into the maintenance hangar. It's Captain Sweat's plane, the one linked to the squadron's worst ammunition-to-kill statistics. McCarthy's fix is simple but doable. Each wing gun mount has adjustment bolts that set the angle. Factory settings aim for 1,000-foot convergence. McCarthy figures he must increase the angle by about 2.4 degrees to bring convergence to 300 feet. The danger is the brackets. They were built for shallow angles and could crack under the heavier recoil loads if angled too steeply, exactly as the engineers warned. McCarthy's answer is reinforcement plates. He cuts quarter-inch steel from a damaged wing panel, shapes it with a file and hacksaw, and welds stout gussets onto each gun mount. Ugly and improvised, but strong. The work takes 6 hours. He adjusts each gun with a wooden jig he fashions from scrap, then bore sights them using the same method his father taught him for aligning car headlights. Set a target frame at exactly 300 feet. Tweak each barrel until it points to the center and lock it in. By 0400 on September 19th, all 6 guns are harmonized for 300 feet. He fires test volleys out over the ocean, 20 rounds per gun, and the reinforcement holds. No cracks, no structural failures. That morning, Captain Sweat comes out to the line and pauses at his Corsair, noticing immediately that the barrels are aimed inward far more sharply than before. "What did you do to my guns?" he asks. McCarthy snaps to attention. "Sir, I adjusted your gun convergence." "To what distance?" 300 feet, sir." Sweat's eyes widen. 300. The manual says. "I know what the manual says, sir," McCarthy replies. Sweat looks from the manual to the guns. "That's against regulations. That's an unauthorized modification of military equipment. That's illegal." "Yes, sir," McCarthy answers. "If this fails, I get court-martialed for making the aircraft unsafe. If it succeeds, you'll be court-martialed for sabotage." Sweat stares at the guns for a long moment, thinking of his wingman torn down in the jungle 3 days earlier, of 400 rounds wasted on a single zero with no hits, and of intercepted Japanese chatter complaining that Corsair fire scatters like rain. "What happens if it works?" he asks. McCarthy allows a small smile. "Sir, you'll kill whatever you look at." Sweat climbs into the cockpit. "Let's find out." The result comes faster than McCarthy expected. At 0830 on September 19, 1943, 4 VMF 2113 Corsairs on combat air patrol intercept 9 Japanese Zeros, escorting 6 Val dive bombers bound for Allied positions on Bougainville. Standard doctrine would say 4 against 15 is bad odds, but Sweat is flying the modified bird. He selects a trailing Zero, dives from 18,000 feet, and holds off firing while closing from 400 yards to 350, still outside the new convergence. The Zero begins jinking to evade. At about 320 feet, Sweat squeezes the trigger and delivers a 1-second burst, roughly 80 rounds. The Zero does not merely take hits. It explodes into pieces. Tail ripped away, fuselage sheared, fuel tanks detonating, a debris cloud so large Sweat must brake hard to avoid it. He keys the radio, half shouting an expletive, then already lines up on the next target. At 300 feet, another 1-second burst. The Zero's left wing is torn off and the plane flips into a fatal spin. A third Zero engaged at about 280 feet with a half-second burst. Ordnance men rarely study engineering manuals, but this one gets handed over anyway, and McCarthy reads it through 3 times. He walks out to the flight line, climbs onto Corsair Bureau number 117883, and measures the gap between the outboard and inboard guns, 16 feet 3 inches. He notes the gun mount angles, and with nothing more than basic trig and the intuition from turning wrenches on car engines, he works out the convergence geometry mentally. The realization hits him hard. The convergence point isn't incorrect so much as it's set too far ahead. At 1,000 feet, a bullet takes almost a second to reach a target. A zero closing at roughly 300 Nm covers about 440 feet in that time. So pilots are shooting at where the enemy was, not where it will be. Move the convergence in to roughly 300 feet, and bullets travel in about a third of a second. The zero moves only about 50 feet during that interval, and aiming becomes far simpler. More important, at 300 feet the combined impacts from all 6 guns land in a space the size of a dinner plate rather than a garbage truck. McCarthy runs the math again. At 300-foot convergence with every Corsair gun firing, the volley concentrates enormous kinetic energy into roughly 6 square feet, enough to utterly destroy a target. A zero, with a 39-foot wingspan and a weight near 5,300 pounds, struck by an 80-round per gun, 1-second burst delivers on the order of 40,000 foot-pounds into that small area. The conclusion is brutal and probably against regs, but McCarthy decides he'll try it that night. He knows a formal request to set convergence inside the 500-foot safety limit would be lost in bureaucracy. Armorers, maintenance officers, squadron commanders, group ops, wing engineering, the Bureau of Aeronautics, committees and demands for stress analyses that would take months, so he keeps quiet. After the flight line shuts down on the night of September 18, 1943, McCarthy and 2 other ordnance men, Corporal Eddie Wilkins and PFC Tommy Reyes, roll Corsair 117883 into the maintenance hangar. It's Captain Sweat's personal airplane, the one tied to the squadron's worst rounds to kill numbers. McCarthy's fix is basic but doable. Each wing gun mount has adjustment bolts to set the angle. The factory aimed them for 1,000-foot convergence. McCarthy figures he must increase the angle by about 2.4 ARG to bring the intersection point to 300 feet. The risk is the mounts. Designed for shallow angles, they could fracture under the increased recoil loads. Exactly what the engineers warned about. McCarthy's answer is reinforcement plates. He cuts quarter-inch steel from a damaged wing panel, shapes it with a file and hacksaw, and welds stout gussets onto each gun mount. Ugly, improvised, but strong. The job takes 6 hours. He adjusts each gun using a wooden jig made from scrap lumber, then bore sights them with a technique his father taught for aligning headlights. Erect a target frame at exactly 300 feet. Tweak each barrel until it points to the center, and lock it down. By 0400 on September 19th, all 6 guns are set to 300 feet. He test fires into the ocean, 20 rounds per gun, and the reinforcement holds. No cracks, no structural failure. That morning, Captain Sweat walks out to the line and pauses at his Corsair, noticing the barrels now aim inward much more steeply. "What did you do to my guns?" he asks. McCarthy snaps to attention. "Sir, I adjusted your gun convergence." "To what distance?" 300 feet, sir." Sweat's eyes widen. 300. The manual says. "I know what the manual says, sir," McCarthy replies. Sweat looks between the manual and the barrels. "That's against regulations. That's an unauthorized modification of military equipment. That is illegal." "Yes, sir," McCarthy answers. "If it fails, I'll be court-martialed for making the aircraft unsafe. If it succeeds, you'll be court-martialed for sabotage." Sweat stares a long moment, thinking of the wingman who plunged into the jungle 3 days earlier, of 400 rounds wasted on a single zero with no hits, and of the intercepted Japanese chatter about Corsair fires scattering like rain. "What happens if it works?" he asks. McCarthy allows a small smile. "Sir, you'll kill whatever you look at." Sweat climbs into the cockpit. "Let's find out." The result is quicker than McCarthy expected. At 0830 on September 19, 1943, 4 VMF 213 Corsairs on combat air patrol intercept 9 Japanese Zeros, escorting 6 Valdive bombers bound for Allied positions on Bougainville. Doctrine says 4 versus 15 are bad odds, but Sweat is flying the modified airplane. He picks a trailing Zero, dives from 18,000 feet, and holds his fire while closing from 400 to 350 yards, still outside the new convergence. The Zero begins jinking. At about 320 feet, Sweat squeezes the trigger and gives a 1-second burst, roughly 80 rounds. The Zero does not merely take damage, it tears apart. Tail sheared off, fuselage broken in two, fuel tanks exploding. A debris cloud so large, Sweat has to brake hard to avoid it. He keys the radio, half shouting an expletive, and already lines up on the next target. At 300 feet a second, 1-second burst rips off the Zero's left wing and sends it into a fatal spin. A third Zero engaged at about 280 feet with a half-second burst. Canopy explodes. Whatever remained of the pilot slumps forward. The plane rolls into a death spiral. Total ammunition used 200 rounds. 3 confirmed kills in 45 seconds, and Sweat's wingmen are still positioning for their first shots. The dogfight lasts 4 minutes. VMF-213 downs 8 Japanese aircraft, and Sweat is credited with 5. He returns to base with 1 loss and 800 rounds left, more than half his ammo. When Sweat shuts down, 30 people gather at his plane. Pilots, mechanics, officers, silent and staring at the gun muzzles. Major Wade Britt, VMF-213's commander, approaches McCarthy. "Sergeant, what did you do to Captain Sweat's guns?" he asks. "I adjusted the Convergence to 300 feet, sir." 300? Britt's voice is flat. "You know that's below the structural safety limit?" "Yes, sir." "You modified squadron aircraft without authorization?" "Yes, sir." "Did you file a modification request with Group Engineering?" "No, sir." The room erupts. Lieutenant Colonel Millington, the operations officer who wrote the memo forbidding Convergence under 500 feet, pushes through the crowd. "This is a direct violation of my orders. You cannot set Convergence at 300 feet. The mounting brackets will fail. The wings will develop stress fractures. This aircraft is unsafe to fly." Major Britt raises a hand. "One flight proves nothing, and stress failures take time to appear. This sergeant has endangered lives and violated regs," he says quietly. Captain Sweat speaks up. "Sir, I just shot down 5 Japanese aircraft with 200 rounds. Before today, I needed 400 rounds to maybe get one." "That's not the point," Millington snaps. "I still have 1 out of 800 rounds left," Sweat replies. "I could have killed 10 more." Another pilot, Lieutenant Robert Hansen, steps forward. "Sir, permission to have my guns modified the same way." "Denied," comes the response. Hansen persists. "We're dying out there because we can't hit anything. McCarthy proved nothing except that enlisted men think they're engineers," Millington retorts. The argument escalates. Half the pilots demand the change. Engineering officers cite structural limits, safety rules, and chain of command. Shouts about court-martials collide with shouts about kill ratios. Major Britt lets them argue for 2 minutes, then whistles sharply and the room goes quiet. "Sergeant McCarthy," Britt says quietly, "can you modify every Corsair in this squadron by tomorrow morning?" Millington explodes. "You cannot authorize—" Britt interrupts with polite defiance. "Colonel, I'm not asking your permission. I'm asking McCarthy if he can do it. If you proceed with this, I'll report it to General Geiger personally." "Good," Britt says. "Save me the trouble." He turns back to McCarthy. "Sergeant?" McCarthy nods. "Yes, sir. I can do it." "Then do it. Every aircraft 300 feet tonight." Millington's face flushes. "This is insubordination. I'm documenting this. You're all getting court-martialed." Britt looks at him. "Colonel, if it works, court-martial me. If it doesn't, the Japanese will kill us anyway. Either way, McCarthy's doing it." This is the turning point. One sergeant with a wrench defied the military engineering bureaucracy because he knew what would work. If this episode teaches anything, it's that sometimes solutions come from the bottom up rather than top down. McCarthy and his ordnance crew worked through the night of September 19, 1943. By dawn, every flyable Corsair in VMF-213, 22 aircraft, had guns set to 300 feet. The Japanese had no idea what was coming. On September 20, 1943, at 11:40 hours, 8 VMF-213 Corsairs intercepted 12 Zeros and 8 Betty bombers over Empress Augusta Bay. Lieutenant Robert Hansen, flying a newly modified Corsair, made the first strike. He picked a Betty at 350 yards, closed to 300 feet, and gave a 2-second burst, about 160 rounds. The Betty's right engine exploded, the wing folded, and the bomber went down trailing a 300-foot column of fire. Hansen broke left, picked out a Zero, fired a 1-second burst, and the Zero's cockpit disintegrated as the plane dove vertically. Total time: 15 seconds, 2 kills, 240 rounds expended. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. VMF-2113 shot down 9 Zeros and 6 Bettys. 15 confirmed kills. Japanese losses were total. Every enemy plane destroyed or damaged beyond recovery. VMF-213 lost none. Rounds expended per kill averaged 180, down from 890 the previous week. The gun camera footage stunned viewers. At 300-foot convergence, the Corsair's 6 guns produced a visible column of tracers, a continuous beam of fire. Japanese airplanes didn't just get struck. They blew apart. Wings sheared off, tails came apart, cockpits imploded. The concentration of fire was so intense, structural failures occurred before all the ammunition had even struck. Word spread quickly. By September 22nd, every Marine fighter squadron in the Solomons was requesting the change. By September 25th, VMF-214, Pappy Boyington's Black Sheep had adopted 300-foot convergence. By October 1st, every F4U Corsair in the Pacific Theater used McCarthy's harmonization. Kill ratios flipped overnight. Before the change, VMF-213's kill-to-loss ratio was 3.2.1, with an average of 890 rounds per kill, and a combat effectiveness rating of 64%. After the change, VMF-213's kill-to-loss ratio rose to 11.3.1, rounds per kill dropped to 190, and combat effectiveness climbed to 94%. On October 17, 1943, Captain James Sweat encountered 6 Zeros over Lavella, shot all 6 down in 4 minutes using 980 rounds, and returned with 1,220 rounds remaining, enough for 6 more kills. On November 11, 1943, Lieutenant Robert Hansen shot down 5 Japanese aircraft in one engagement using 750 rounds, then rearmed, took off again, and shot down 3 more that afternoon. The Japanese noticed at once. A captured pilot, questioned by Marine Intelligence on October 24, 1943, reported, "The American Corsairs had changed. Before we could dodge their tracers, they scattered. Now when they fire, there is no dodging. Their bullets form a solid wall. If they aim at you, you die. We call them concentrated death. Our orders are to avoid them. If we must fight, ram the Corsair rather than be shot down." Another intercepted transmission, dated November 3, 1943, warned all units. American fighters have new guns. Their fire is concentrated like a laser. Old evasive moves fail. Do not engage Corsairs below 500 meters. Repeat, do not engage. The alteration saved lives on a vast scale. From September 20th through December 31, 1943, Marine Corsair squadrons in the Solomons shot down 487 confirmed Japanese aircraft, while losing 43 Corsairs, a kill ratio of 11.31 matching the Corsair's wartime record. Ammunition efficiency improved by 368%. Marines finished missions with rounds to spare instead of going Winchester and becoming exposed. Pilot survival rates soared. Before the change, fighter pilot deaths averaged 4.7 KIA per week. Afterward, they fell to 1.2 per week. The 300-foot convergence didn't only increase kills, it let pilots disengage when outnumbered, confident they could strike effectively and conserve ammo for defense. On January 3, 1944, Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, flying a McCarthy-modified Corsair, shot down his 28th Japanese plane, tying Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record. Boyington credited the harmonization directly. "Before McCarthy's fix, I was a good pilot with mediocre results. After the fix, every squeeze of the trigger was a kill. This modification made me an ace." On February 18, 1944, the Marine Corps formally adopted 300-foot convergence for all F4U Corsairs. Bureau of Aeronautics Engineers, the same people who had insisted the change was structurally impossible, ran belated stress tests and found McCarthy's reinforcement brackets actually improved wing strength under combat loads. The modification manual published in March 1944 lists BuAer engineering staff as authors. McCarthy's name is absent. He remained a sergeant, an ordnance man loading rounds on the line, though the pilots never forgot. At VMF 213's December 1943 Christmas party, Captain James Sweat, who finished with 15.5 confirmed kills, all after McCarthy adjusted his guns, stood and spoke. Most of you don't know Mickey McCarthy. He's not a pilot. He loads our bullets and tightens our gun bolts. I'm alive because Mickey ignored orders and did what was right, instead of what was authorized. I shot down 5 Japanese in one mission, because my guns actually hit what I aimed at. Every pilot here owes his life to a sergeant who thought he knew better than the engineers. Turns out he did. Sweat raised his glass to Mickey McCarthy, the deadliest Marine who never pulled a trigger, and the room roared. McCarthy, embarrassed, hovered at the back and muttered, "I just adjusted some bolts." He adjusted bolts that saved 800 Marine lives in 4 months. One modification, 800 lives saved. The Corsair went from a good fighter to the Pacific's deadliest aircraft because a sergeant had the nerve to ignore the experts. If you believe innovation happens at every level, and the best ideas don't always come from the top, remember Mickey McCarthy, and make sure he's not forgotten. The Marine Corps never formally acknowledged Staff Sergeant Michael McCarthy's role. There was no medal ceremony, no commission, no entry in his service record crediting the change. The BuAer manual credited the 300-foot setting to engineering analysis and field trials. McCarthy's name is not mentioned. He did not seem to mind. After the war, he mustered out in December 1945, returned to Boston, opened a garage, fixed cars, and married a schoolteacher named Helen. He rarely spoke of the war. When customers asked if he'd done anything notable in the Marines, he shrugged, "I loaded ammunition. Nothing special." The pilots who flew his modified Corsairs were no different. Captain James Sweat, later a Marine legend with 15.5 confirmed kills, had received the Medal of Honor for actions on April 7, 1943, before McCarthy's change, but in his 1989 memoir Sweat wrote, "I'm credited with shooting down 15.5 Japanese aircraft. People call me an ace, a hero, a tactician. The truth is simpler. I had a plane with guns that worked the way they should have from the beginning. A sergeant nobody's heard of made that happen. Mickey McCarthy made me an ace. He made all of us aces. The Marine Corps should have given him the Navy Cross. Instead, they gave him nothing. That's not right." Lieutenant Robert Hansen, who downed 25 Japanese before he was killed in action on February 3, 1944, wrote in January 1944 to his family, "There's a sergeant in our squadron who changed everything. He adjusted our guns so they actually hit what we shoot at. Sounds simple, but it's the difference between living and dying up here. If I make it home, I'm going to find that sergeant and buy him a drink." Hansen never made it home. The 300-foot gun Convergence McCarthy pioneered became the standard for U.S. fighters for the rest of World War II. The P-51 Mustang, P-47 Thunderbolt, and P-38 Lightning adopted similar settings inspired by McCarthy's field modifications. Post-war analysis credits the tighter Convergence with raising overall U.S. fighter kill ratios by 34%. Modern U.S. military aviation still relies on the core idea McCarthy uncovered. Concentrate fire at close combat ranges rather than optimize for long-range dispersion. The F-16's M61, Vulcan, and the F-35's GAU-22A are harmonized to maximize hit probability at comparable engagement distances, the contemporary echo of McCarthy's 300-foot solution. Mickey McCarthy died of a heart attack on July 8, 1979 in Boston at age 62. His Boston Globe obituary was 3 sentences long, noted only his status as a Marine veteran, and made no mention of his role in reshaping aerial combat. In 1987, the Marine Corps Aviation Association placed a plaque at the National Museum of the Marine Corps honoring unsung aviation heroes. McCarthy's name appears in small letters at the bottom of a list as SSG Michael McCarthy, VMF 2Ha-113 Ordnance Crew, with no explanation or context. Still, Every Marine pilot who reads that plaque knows the story. Sometimes the greatest warriors are those who never fired a shot. Sometimes the deadliest weapons are not guns but the people who make them work. Remember Mickey McCarthy. Remember that courage isn't always about pulling triggers. Sometimes it's about turning bolts. Remember that the best solutions don't come from following rules blindly, but from knowing when to break them. Rank doesn't determine who holds the right answer. Results do. The F4U Corsair didn't reach an 11.1 kill ratio because it was merely fast or powerful. It reached that level because one sergeant questioned a consensus and refused to accept it. 800 Marines came home because Mickey McCarthy knew how to use a wrench.